On December of 1878, the High Commissioner of Southern Africa, Sir Bartle Frere, gives a 13-point ultimatum to the Zulu king Cetshwayo with two very significant demands: disband the Zulu army and discontinue the Zulu military system. This was a preposterous deal for Cetshwayo, because the Zulus depended on the regiment system to keep their society together. And that's exactly what the British wanted: to disband any independent settlements and to unite South Africa under one rule. As you might imagine, Cetshwayo refused to comply, so Frere ordered Lord Chelmsford to move into Zulu land from Rorke's Drift on the 11th of January 1879. Let's quickly look at the mindsets of both sides. Chelmsford was overconfident, and many in his position would be. The British troops were equipped with the state-of-the-art Martini Henry breech-loading rifles, and the Zulus were equipped with mostly spears, cowhide shields, and outdated muskets and rifles. Chelmsford is even quoted as saying, "My only fear is that the Zulu will not fight." Cetshwayo wasn't ignorant of the technological disadvantage his troops had. He strenuously attempted to avoid war, but when it became clear that it was inevitable, he ordered his troops to only defend their country if attacked, and not to carry the war beyond the Zulu borders. He knew he was facing impossible odds, and needed to utilize every advantage he had. Chelmsford split his force into 5 columns, expecting the Zulu to engage in hit-and-run tactics. The plan was to attempt to surround the Zulu army and force it to fight in open battle. The 2nd and 3rd column, commanded by Chelmsford, camped at Isandlwana on the 20th of January, but did not take any defensive precautions, especially the forming of the laager, or known as the circling of the wagons, citing that the defenses would take a week to make. Some scouts reported some Zulu contingent ahead, and Chelmsford took half of the force in Isandlwana to seek them out, believing it was the vanguard of the Zulu army. But it didn't occur to him that the Zulus were maneuvering him away from the main Zulu force. The rest of the British force of around 1,800 men were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pulane, with help of Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Durnford that had just arrived from Rorke's Drift. The Zulu diversion had worked. The main Zulu army moved behind Chelmsford and camped near the British at Isandlwana. At around 8 a.m. of the 22nd of January, Pulane's scouts reported large forces of Zulus on the left flank of the camp. Durnford led his contingent of mounted units and artillery to the right flank of the British camp. Around 11 a.m., the main Zulu force was discovered. Upon discovery, the Zulus leapt into full offensive, developing in the traditional horns and chest of the buffalo in attempt to encircle the British position. Pulane ordered a defensive line to meet the right horn and chest head-on. Durnford's line retreated back to the dried-out watercourse to hold off the left horn of the Zulu. After about an hour of fighting, Pulane retreated slightly closer to the camp. The British volley pinned the center, stalling the advance, but Durnford's men began to withdraw, exposing the right flank. The break of the right flank forced Pulane to order a retreat back to camp, in fear of encirclement. An officer from Chelmsford's force reached the battlefield and gave his eyewitness account of the final stage of the battle at around 3 p.m. Quote, "In a few seconds we distinctly saw the guns fire again, one after the other, sharp. This was done several times, a pause, and then a flash. The sun was shining on the camp at the time, and the camp looked dark, just as if a shadow was passing over it. The guns did not fire after that, and in a few minutes, all the tents had disappeared." End quote. He's describing a solar eclipse that happened on the day at around 2:30 p.m. By the time the sun had come out again, nearly the entire British force had been wiped out. This has been the worst defeat a modern army had faced against a technologically inferior force. Of the 1,800 men, about 1,300 were killed, including both field commanders Pulane and Durnford. Rorke's Drift sat by the Buffalo River that formed the border between the British colony of Natal and the Zulu kingdom. It was outside of Zululand, but the survivors of Isandlwana that brought the news of defeat insisted that fresh Zulu troops were on their way to the station. Rorke's Drift only had about 400 men compared to the 1,800 at Isandlwana. It was a mission station converted into a supply depot and hospital commanded by two men, Lieutenant John Chard and Lieutenant Gonfield Bromhead. They both figured a retreat would most likely result in their slow-moving garrison being caught up by the faster-moving Zulu force, and that would surely mean their end. So they only had one choice, to defend Rorke's Drift. A wall of melee bags were constructed along the defensive perimeter. The buildings were fortified with firing holes knocked through the walls. 100 men of the Natal cavalry from Isandlwana were posted on a hill southeast of the camp. The Natal native contingent of around 250 men were posted on the kraal. Chard also stationed the more able-bodied patients and civilians to the defensive perimeter. The approaching Zulu army numbered at around 3,000 to 4,000 men, referred to as the Undi Corps. They formed the loins of the buffalo in Isandlwana and didn't participate in the fighting. Commanded by Prince Dabulamanzi Kapandi, half-brother of Cachwayo, the Undi Corps was to swing around the British flank and cut communications to Rorke's Drift. But perhaps due to the elation caused by the victory at Isandlwana, Dabulamanzi violates King Cachwayo's direct orders and invades into British territory. At around 4:20 p.m., the battle begins with the Natal cavalry engaging the vanguard of the Zulu. But exhausted from fighting at Isandlwana, the Natal cavalry quickly retreats away from the battlefield. Seeing this, the Natal native contingent begins to flee, leaving only about 150 men of Bromhead's company to garrison the defenses. 4:30 p.m., the Zulu vanguard attacks the south wall, while the majority of the attacking force swept around to attack the north wall. Zulus were also deployed for harassing fire with their own firearms. While this was happening, another Zulu force attacked the hospital and northwest wall, and the British and the Zulu on the barricade engaged in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. Chard realizes that the north wall was under almost constant attack and could not be held. At 6 p.m., he pulled his men back into the yard, abandoning a part of the hospital in the process. The hospital was becoming unsustainable, and the firing holes had become a liability. The rifles poking out were grabbed by the Zulus, but if the holes were left empty, the Zulu soldiers would stick their own weapons and fired into the rooms. When it became clear that the hospital was being overrun, the trapped defenders began to make their escape through the walls, dragging the patients to the walls they made in the holes, while some held the Zulus off, while the hospital began burning. The Zulu attacks grew with intensity at nightfall. The kraal came under renewed assault and was evacuated by 10 p.m. The Zulu kept constant assault until 2 a.m., which was then replaced by a constant harassing fire until 4 a.m. In the break of dawn, the Zulus had disappeared. All that remained was the dead and severely wounded. But around 7 a.m., a Zulu contingent suddenly appeared and the British manned positions. But to their surprise, no attack came. The Zulus that appeared had been on the move a week prior and was several days' march away from any supplies. So soon after their appearance, they left. Around 8 a.m., another force was discovered. But to the relief of the defenders, it was the vanguard of Lord Chancellor's column. After nearly 10 hours of fighting, the battle was over. 17 British soldiers were killed and about 15 wounded. But for the Zulus, it was a completely different story. 350 killed and 500 wounded. The overconfidence of the British helped the Zulu with their victory at Isandlwana, but the overconfidence of the Zulu led to the British victory in Rorke's Drift.